Thanks everybody for coming. I wish that we could all be together, but unfortunately we cannot. I want to thank Roberta for inviting me to HLS, and I do have a live audience in front of me, so if my eyes stray towards them, I apologize, but I'll try to be interactive for everybody. And today I'm going to talk about heritage language epistemology. So this is a workshop convening scholars, asynchronously, but still convening scholars, working on heritage languages and heritage language acquisition and processing, the sociolinguistics of heritage language, the grammar of heritage language. So we all know the object of our study. So I'm going to ask the people in the audience here, if you could raise your hand, and at home, feel free to raise your hand, if you definitely know what a heritage speaker is. So everybody raise your hand. I'm going to look up. Do you definitely know? No emphasis on the definitely. Do you know what a heritage speaker is? Yes. Okay. So we have most hands raised here. Very nice. Well, if you've seen any talks by me, it really doesn't matter what the topic is. I play a game and we're going to play it today as well. So I'm going to read to you, I think 7 or 8, it might be 8 scenarios. All you need to do, maybe you want to take a pen and paper if you have one at your arm's length, and you're going to give yourself a point or just put a scratch on a piece of paper if you think that any scenario or every scenario or some scenarios constitute a description of a type of heritage speaker. So I'm going to start with Max. Max is 12 years old. He lives in Florida, which is in the United States. His mother's from Germany and his father is American. Max has pretty good oral proficiency in German and English, German being a language spoken to him at home, presumably by his mom and probably family members. But he's quite dominant in English, which is the only language he can read and write in. Is Max a heritage speaker? If yes, you have 1 scratch or 1 point. Joao's 30. He was born in Brazil and he moved to Portugal when he was 11. Joao speaks both Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese extremely well. Depending on the interlocutor, it's obvious when he's using one system or the other. Yet it would be fair to say that Joao is dominant in European Portuguese and that his Brazilian Portuguese has some, let's say, interesting innovations to it. Is Joao a heritage speaker? That's his Pedro, but his real name's Uner, as you can see. Uner's 25. He was born in Germany to immigrants from Turkey. He was enrolled in a dual language immersion bilingual program until grade 4, when his parents switched him to German-only medium education. He's a prolific code switcher between German and Turkish. Although he feels comfortable in Turkish and German, he finds some difficulty communicating in German and Turkish specifically for certain topics, especially when a high register is contextually appropriate. Is Uner a heritage speaker? Lisa is 15 years old. She lives in the Spanish Harlem area of New York City. Both of her parents are English monolingual Americans, being brought up, however, in a Hispanic neighborhood, having most of her friends as native Spanish speakers, as well as being a member of a Spanish-speaking church, which is seemingly important in her family's life. Lisa speaks Spanish very well, merely from being exposed to it amply in her environment all her life. Is Lisa a heritage speaker? Ping is 26 years old. He was born in Los Angeles soon after his parents came from China. He grew up speaking Mandarin only until he went to school, where English was introduced and Mandarin input decreased significantly. He attended a dual language immersion magnet Chinese-English school in Los Angeles. Therefore, Ping can read, write, speak, and comprehend Mandarin very well. In fact, his cousins tell him they can't reliably tell he was not raised in China, except for the quote, funny things he says. However, Ping feels much more confident in English depending on the topic and indeed the audience to whom he is speaking. Is Ping a heritage speaker? Tihana is now 30. She was born in Italy, a child of a Croatian mother and an Italian father. Her mother has always spoken to her solely in Croatian, although she never taught her to read and write in Croatian. At the age of 18, Tihana moved back to Croatia for university. She fell in love, and she stayed in Croatia ever since. Well, that's 12 years. Is Tihana a heritage speaker? Anna is 19, was born in Armenia, where she lived through the age of 6. At the age of 8, Anna became orphaned and was adopted by a lovely family in Canada. Since moving to Canada, Anna has had extremely little contact with people who speak Armenian, never really having an opportunity to use it again. She's now belabored to even understand much of anything in Armenian, but is determined to take the language back at university next year. Is Anna a heritage speaker? Sven is 92 years old. God bless him. He's from the Midwest of the United States. He's a third-generation descendant of Swedish immigrants. Sven grew up in a tight-knit Lutheran Christian community of other Swedish descendants. In this community, historically, people tended to marry within the group, as did he. He is one of the last speakers of US Swedish in his Minnesota community. Although he has 3 children, the language was not passed on to them. Is Sven a heritage speaker? Zoliswa is 32 and from South Africa. Her ancestral language is Zulu. Her grandparents spoke the language dominantly, but were highly proficient L2 learners of English. While both her parents were Zulu English naturalistic bilinguals, they did not use it, that is Zulu, much in their home. Zoliswa has always known a few cultural words, but she was not raised bilingual. Starting 3 years ago, she began a journey to reclaim Zulu in night classes at her university. She is now quite proficient. Is Zoliswa a heritage speaker? And finally, how many was that? 7 or 8? Are we on number 8 now? Yeah. Fatima is from Syria and is 16 years old. 8 years ago, she moved to Germany, displaced by the civil war in her country. She has integrated to Germany quite well. She's doing excellently in school and speaks German and Arabic well, but shows signs of German dominance. She speaks Syrian Arabic at home, but where her family was settled, there is not a huge community of Syrians and thus many people to speak Arabic with. It's Fatima, a heritage speaker. So now what's your number? I'm going to turn my eyes to the audience again. We had 8 scenarios. So you can, if you consider all of them to be types of heritage speakers or just heritage speakers, then you can have an 8. You can have all the way to 0 if none of them conform to your definition or understanding of heritage speakers. So by a show of hands at home too, how many of you have an 8? All 8 scenarios would constitute heritage speakers. 7? There's several 7s. We had no 8s in the audience, just so you know. 6. 5. 4. 3. 2, 1, and 0. Well, that's actually really great because I do this a lot and the conformity is usually not between 5 and 7. It often is between 1 or 2 and all the way up to 8, okay? There's many consequences for the fact that we don't have the same numbers. Again, I'm in a room of people who are largely very interested in heritage languages, work on heritage languages, or language acquisition in general. So it should even be surprising that we all just don't have the same number. Certainly we all know what a heritage speaker is. Everybody raised their hand, by the way. But clearly we have different criteria for inclusion in what a heritage speaker is. The consequences of this are not small, let's say, okay? Because even as researchers, and I imagine, unfortunately, we're not in a room as we should be in Utrecht, we would see that there was a similar range or even a greater range. The more people, likely there would be a greater range. Well, when we're having discussions, epistemological discussions, the title of this talk, one of the things we have to consider is when we agree and we disagree, maybe especially when we disagree, are we sure we're talking about the same people? Are we sure we're including the same people? Those of you who are students and studying this is quite non-trivial, actually, when you think about it. Okay, so let's start with the working definition, first of what a heritage language is. A heritage language qualifies as a heritage language if it is a language spoken at home or otherwise readily available to young children. And crucially, most crucially, this language is not a dominant language of the larger national society. As a consequence of this, that means that heritage speakers are bilinguals, but not all bilinguals are heritage speakers, right? We have a crucial qualifier there of the juxtaposition of the 2 languages at play. And what we know from their outcomes is there's a possibility that quantitative and qualitative differences in heritage language input, influence of the societal majority language, and differences in literacy and formal education, among many other, by the way. You know, if I wrote this in 2020, I would add a lot more clauses here, can result in what on the surface seems to be arrested development. So what have linguistic studies in their aggregate, what do they tell us over the past 20 years or so in terms of the outcomes of heritage language grammatical competence? Okay, so these are the trends, and this is really collapsing across a lot of research. So it's big brushstroke, but quite on purpose. Heritage language grammatical competence and performance differ from monolinguals in various domains of grammar. Okay, there are differences. They're not surprising, but there are differences. And this is just to be an acknowledgement. I don't think anybody denies this. Heritage speakers often show partial, I'd prefer to say distinct knowledge, as opposed to an utter lack of knowledge of certain properties. Let me give you an example so that makes sense. So we take Spanish as a prolifically studied heritage language, especially in the context of North America, but in recent years has been done in many countries, including Holland. We have somebody here, and really all over the world in contact with many languages. So if we take a particular domain of grammar, let's say subjunctive modality, it's not necessarily the case, and certainly true of what is seen in many studies in the United States. It wouldn't be fair to say that heritage speakers of Spanish, although they use the subjunctive differently, don't have the subjunctive, or they don't have a functional projection for mood. In obligatory context, heritage speakers of Spanish are very reliable, typically anyway, very reliable in producing subjunctive, right? However, that doesn't mean that the entirety of subjunctive is used in the same way. So let's say in polarity conditions, for example, where there's a choice between the indicative and the subjunctive, not without some consequence in meaning or integration of the discourse function. Here we see where heritage speakers, where there's optionality in the grammar, there might be some regularization. And interestingly enough, it doesn't necessarily go in the direction of what you would expect towards indicative. In fact, the study that we did over a decade ago showed that it went in the opposite direction, but nonetheless, there was kind of a leveling of that optionality. Okay, so we wouldn't conclude that they don't have the subjunctive. What we would say is that their subjunctive mood system seems to be different. Okay, heritage language grammatical competence and performance differ from one another to various degrees. The spectrum is seemingly much wider than for other sets of native speakers. One thing I will underline today and remind everybody of is that heritage speakers are native speakers. And one of the most interesting things about heritage speakers is that as a group, they show a lot greater variation than other sets of monolinguals. And by the way, from that, you should understand that we all acknowledge and should acknowledge that, of course, monolingual speakers or dominant native speakers also have variation in their systems, but not to the degree when we look at the spectrum of heritage speakers. So that's essentially what makes me very interested in them in particular. Heritage language grammars recycle existing properties. Everything you see is likely not influenced from the majority language, even if it could be. And by recycling, I mean taking something that is licitly grammatical in other contexts within the baseline grammar and kind of commandeering it and applying it in a way that sometimes looks like it could be a cross-linguistic influence. Potentially it is, but sometimes it's there and it couldn't be cross-linguistic influence, but it doesn't seem to be just something that appears out of the blue, okay? Yet, heritage language grammars are coherent and universally compliant, and that's important to understand. They are different, but they are systematic grammars, period, okay? So this is kind of a simulation. This is taken from Montreal 2012. I'm gonna walk you through what the development of heritage grammars are, heritage speakers in terms of their majority language and their heritage language. So we'll start with the majority language, and for those heritage speakers that are exposed at birth, so simultaneous heritage speakers born in the country of the majority language country, potentially to one or both parents who at home are speaking another language, you see a natural progression of development, and this more or less mirrors what you expect of even monolingual children, okay? Now, if they start later, because sometimes heritage speakers might move at the age of 2 or 3 or even close to 4. After 4, we would probably make a distinction between than being a simultaneous, and now call them a child second language learner. Note that the heritage language is always one of the first languages. You'll see that in the next line. What you see is a steeper kind of curve, right? Because they're already 4 when they're exposed. They catch up rather quickly, but the overall development over time and sustained throughout the lifespan in the majority language seems to parallel that of native monolinguals as well. Now let's see what happens with their heritage grammar. What you can see is that there's this normal development, or this typical, normal is not the right word, but a typical development through school age, okay? Now, I have to say that this is recreated and this is simulated because there is not enough data in the stages between where there is. And let me unpack that for you. We know quite a bit, and for a very long time, whether they were called heritage speakers or not, we know a lot about simultaneous bilingualism, especially in the context of Europe, where a good portion of this would qualify, given the definition we used, as heritage speakers. We also know a lot about the adult outcomes. The vast majority of the literature over the past 2 decades has been focused often on people we have the most access to, right? 18 to 21-year-olds, college students who can come to our labs, right? So we know a lot about the adult outcomes. We could know more, but we know quite a bit. There are exceedingly few studies between when people tend to not look so much at simultaneous bilingualism, except for late acquired properties, but certainly not the entire spectrum of grammatical properties. So that is the end of early childhood, and then there's a gap, and then all of a sudden we know a lot, okay? So this is, these arrows are to demonstrate where the missing gap is. So that dotted green line there is really connecting the dots between the beginning and the end. That also means that a lot of what we say about development of heritage grammars is reverse engineered from end state grammars. And that's something that we're correcting and we need to be correcting in the literature. Okay, of course, we know a lot of them. But note here, this point of expected divergence, and it's not random, right? What is that, 6, 7 years old? What does that coincide with, everybody here? Schooling, okay? Schooling, where you would expect that there are dramatic differences in the quantities, at least the quantities, if not qualities of the input, right? Children make connections and will be inundated by the majority language, their friends and their social relationships and so on. And it becomes a struggle to maintain, at least for some, to maintain the value and the continuation of the language, okay? Okay, so why? These are native speakers. Keep remembering that. These are native speakers. How do we get that green line to be comparatively, by the way, right? Because remember we said that these are complete universally compliant systems, but comparatively so different from what is the assumed potential baseline that they have. It's a quandary. Okay, so there's various explanations for this. I'm gonna go through probably the most well-known of them. Incomplete acquisition or arrested development. You know me, you know I don't love the term incomplete acquisition, but arrested development, basically the same thing. The idea would be that dotted green line in the space of the data we don't have access to in terms of those years, let's say from 8 or 9 years old till, you know, late teens. We're assuming that development has kind of either stopped or has been significantly slowed down, arrested, what the word arrested means. It could also be individual level attrition between childhood and adulthood. So it could be that there's a continuation of development, but that there's an actual loss of properties. And you can see this if you look at early acquired properties in simultaneous bilinguals, and then you look at the older outputs of them. And actually, in a really wonderful study by Masha Polinsky in 2011, she did just that with Russian, right? Where she then compared a child group to an adult group, but you're still reconstructing backwards in the middle. It's a defensible argument because the children had it and the adult versions of them, as it were, didn't. Qualitative input differences and or cross-generational attrition. So this is not attrition in the same way at the individual level. This would be the passing along of attrition that happens in the parental and community, if it's large enough. Spanish is certainly large enough to talk about US Spanish and US Spanish communities. Changes that have happened as a consequence of attrition in previous generations, so that the quality of the input that they're receiving is different, not evaluatively different, just different. Differences based on access to literacy and formal register exposure. I would put to you that one of the reasons that monolinguals have less of a spectrum of variation, although we acknowledge they still have it, is because they have an equalizer. And that equalizer is, irrespective of your native dialect, I'm unconsciously not speaking to you in my native East Coast, probably trashy, New York English. I am unconsciously, by consequence of the trajectory of my education, speaking to you in a much more standard variety than if you, my mom usually calls, by the way, so she probably will. I'll pick up for you later. She has radar and calls when I give talks. I would speak unconsciously differently. But the equalizer is that as educated individuals, we have access to and are indirectly and sometimes directly trained in a standard variety with which we're expected in certain contexts. So we control multiple registers. It's not clear the extent to which heritage speakers have the same control of different registers. And interestingly, in formal linguistics, we tend to test standardized registers because they exist. They're real grammatical properties. That's the point of interest, right? Okay. Complete acquisition via different paths. So this is something that Mike Putnam and colleagues, Eliana Sanchez, have developed, and this is giving kind of a featural-based explanation of how the bundling of features might just come to be different for various reasons. So they develop a complete grammar, but with a trajectory that is even predictable towards its difference. And then, as I mentioned before, heritage grammar recycling. And those are innovations within the grammar, but they seem to come from other aspects within the grammar and or innovations related to cross-linguistic influence. These are not mutually exclusive, by the way. So this is not meant to be, I don't think anybody's ever intended, certainly I have not with the things that are attributed to me, as this will explain everything, but various parts of grammars and a combination of these things likely are multiple contributors to the same outcomes of heritage languages, okay? But I want to highlight to you, even the stuff that I've promoted for the past 15 years tends to take this perspective of the image I'm showing you here. There's something missing. There's a bite out of the apple if the apple is the complete end result that we expect. I'm going to challenge that as we go through. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. Incomplete acquisition versus attrition versus input to limited differences. Well, they all take a monolingual norm. And remember, most monolinguals, especially the ones we have in our controls, we describe monolingual registers. There's a wonderful literature. We describe dialects, but that's not what we're testing heritage speakers against. We're testing them not against Appalachian English or Black Vernacular English or Southern English versus Northeastern coastal English in the United States. They're compared against the standard. If it's Mexican Spanish, most people, then maybe it's Mexican Spanish. But of course, there's the same variation, maybe even more in Spanish, okay? So all of these take monolingualism as a point of comparison, or at least that competent idealized speaker, and that's problematic, okay? So let me take you through a couple studies. I'm going to go through two studies. The first is a study, and here are pictures of all my colleagues. I'm not going to say all their names, but this was a study that was led by Fatih Bayram. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to try to add a drop in the bucket of what needs to be done in that middle group. So these are 10 to 16-year-olds. Remember that data that we need much more of. So those of you who are out there, do those studies, right? That's the age range we want to have because the data just doesn't exist in the quantity we need to understand it, okay? So we're gonna do that. And we're gonna be looking at passives. We're gonna do this in Turkish and German. So these are Turkish heritage speakers in Germany. I will explain as we go through. Passives were chosen in particular for really two reasons. The first is because we know that they're relatively late acquired in most, but not all languages, and there's independent reasons for that. Point to this literature that you can check out and why in some languages, although few, passives are not as late as in other languages, but they're typically late, and they are late in both Turkish and German. The other reason for looking at passives is precisely because passives is a structure, which also might contribute to its lateness, that is not exceedingly available in input, but is something that we see much more frequently in higher registers of the grammar, and especially the educated variety of the grammar. Okay. Nonetheless, of course, it's still omnipresent, but not super prevalent. Okay. Another reason we looked at this is because of the difference in the structure, which is quite interesting, and this language combination. So I'm not going to belabor too much about German because we all must be speaking English natively or as an additional language, or I apologize, you have no idea what I'm saying. So I'm going to assume for a second that we all speak English, and German doesn't vary too much from English. Of course, the word order does, and the idiosyncratic properties, and of course, there's overt marked case in German, and that has consequences, as you can just see in the glosses, but more or less, it works like it does in German with the biphrase and everything. But that's not the case in Turkish. Turkish is an agglutinative language, obviously as such, quite morphologically rich. And the way that passives are formed in Turkish is, as you can see by comparing the first sentence to the second sentence, I'm not going to embarrass myself and try to say this for you. What you can see is that the alamor of n or n in the second sentence is an independent morpheme whose meaning is passive. Okay, so what you do is you take the verb, you can see yedi, I said I wouldn't say it, but now I just did it. And what you do is you have insertion, morphological insertion, and you get a passive meaning. Now note also that Turkish has overt case, right? The absence of a morpheme is nominative. And then for the other cases, so in this case, accusative, you have an overt marker. So notice that also in Turkish, not only do you have the morpheme that's inserted, this is passive, you have a change in case as you would expect. Okay, right? So that's important, and it's important because when you see the methodology, we never ever give anybody a passive. And unlike in a language like English or German, where it's composed of other words that exist, right? You have a past tense of the verb to be, you have a past participle that are used in other constructions. They can't just on the fly construct this. They either know the independent morphology or they don't. So we're going to really see if they have it in Turkish. Okay, so our research questions is, do Turkish heritage speakers in Germany have, at this young age, the morphosyntax of passives? If they can correctly produce it, and by produce it, we're talking about the morpheme and the case alternations that we would expect, do they use it in the same way? And you'll see how that comes to bear in the methodology. And then finally, if there are differences between heritage speakers and controls, but more importantly, individual differences between heritage speaker individuals and the groups, how and why might this obtain? In other words, what explains, if anything, which heritage speakers are more likely to perform in a particular way than others? This is another question that needs more research. In my view, humbly, we have almost enough data to tell us that heritage speakers are different. Now we need to really understand how and why, okay? Not just for monolinguals. In fact, forget about them, why they differ from each other. Okay, so we have some variables that we'll put into a mixed effects logistic regression model, and these factors are age, so the age at testing. Remember we said it was between 10 and 16. I believe it's around 13 or just under 13 is the average. You'll actually in the next slide see that. We have parents as a factor, and there are three possibilities. It could be that both parents are second generation. I probably should have said the Turkish community is quite large and has existed at least in big numbers since the 70s in Germany. And so it is possible to probably even have third generation parents at this point. But we had some individuals, both parents are themselves heritage speakers. That's what that means by second generation. We have families where one is a first generation, that is people who moved from Turkey to Germany, but the other parent is a heritage speaker of Turkish. In all cases, both parents speak Turkish, okay? It's the quality of it. And in other cases, both parents came from Turkey. And then we have literacy, and admittedly, this is quite a crude measure, but the point of it is to have it as a crude measure. You either had no literacy, low level of literacy. What that means for our purposes is you read things online, you attempt to read like low-level books or magazines more than anything, and you text, say, your cousins and other people in Turkish, but you have never had any type of formal education, but you're engaging. And then medium level of literacy, these are people who had up to 3 years of Turkish supplementary school, not a bilingual immersion school, but Turkish supplementary school, which is provided by the Turkish government all over Germany. And high level of literacy are people who've had 5 years or more of this Turkish supplemental school, which literally teaches you Turkish literacy, okay? Okay, this is the distribution. We had 22 heritage speakers and 20 in each of the control groups. Okay, this is the elicited production task. We have 14 sets of 4 pictures, 2 pictures with a pragmatic shift towards the theme or patient in each set. That's meant to induce or increase the likelihood of a passive response. And it's presented 1 picture at a time. And so there were 28 opportunities, let's say. I'm saying opportunities because you don't have to give a passive. This is elicited production, but when you ask a patient-focused question, for example, it increases the odds that you're going to get it. It's also possible in the other 2 pictures, the other 28 pictures that a passive has produced, it never happened as we would expect. Okay, so it kind of looked like this. The researcher gave a first picture. What's happening in this first picture? There's small fish, okay? Now what's happening in the second picture? We're easing them into this. So there's 2 pictures. Now we're going to shift the type of question we ask. What is happening to the small fish in the third picture? Okay, and here's where we think there's a greater likelihood that a passive will be produced. And again, to give them another opportunity, well, now what's happening to the small fish in the fourth picture? Okay, so just to tell you, there are 4 data sets, but 3 types of learners, because we tested both their German and their Turkish of the heritage speakers. So now what you see here is 4 sets of data, but the heritage speakers are the same. Does that make sense? In one case, it's their majority language under German, and in the other case, it's their heritage Turkish, and then we have controls. Okay, so let's first look at the controls compared to each other, just to make sure that there is, well, not to make sure, but to see if indeed there is a difference, okay? By the way, I have to say, in terms of counting, when we counted something as a passive in either language, it was always provided completely correctly. And that means, you know, for Turkish that they provided the morpheme and they had proper casional alternation. And I have to say, there was not one error, actually. There was a difference in individuals and how much they used it, but every single one of the heritage speakers did it at least once. And because they can't just bleed blood from a stone, that means that they have the structure, okay? Okay, so now let's look at this. What we can see is, fortunately for us, it makes it somewhat interesting. There is quite a bit of difference. So although we asked them 28 theme or patient-focused questions, on average, the German monolinguals or the German dominant native speakers answered a little bit more than 7 times on average with a passive structure. And again, they always did it correctly. The Turkish did it 19 times out of 28. Good for them. Okay, that's great. And there are, I'm not going to get into it, but there's reasons and documentation in the literature for why that might be that difference. Okay. So now let's look at the heritage speaker group and what they do in German compared to native controls. And what you can see is that there is a greater distribution, but they are more or less the same. So on average, it's about 7. Now, oh, I went back. Now we're looking at, again, the same heritage speakers. They're Turkish versus that Turkish control. And what you can see is that there's quite a bit of difference, okay? However, you should note that the overlap in the bars, especially with there were some native dominant speakers who performed like heritage speakers, or better said, vice versa. Okay, so there's quite a bit of range, but you can see that there's overlapping in the error bars, right? So that means some individuals are completely overlapping. Okay. Now, interestingly, what we want to do is we're looking at the heritage speakers' performance, and this is now by average quantity of providing it in Turkish versus German. And what you see is that if there is some influence from German, it's in the context of prompting the use of passives. So they are, as a group, different, and they are not statistically different from each other between their German providing of the passive versus what they do in Turkish. Okay. Okay, so we said all that. The rate of using passives in Turkish is different from the heritage speaker group. So now we want to know, well, are all of them the same? You already saw that the error bar is actually quite big, so it's not the same. And we saw that some, but not all of the heritage speakers individuals are overlapping in the error bar that's reported for the monolinguals. So what predicts where you're going to fall on that range that we saw? Okay, so remember the variables. It was age, parents, literacy. I'm going to spoil it for you. I already flashed you the thing. Nothing comes out significant except for. So it didn't matter whether you had two parents who spoke Turkish at home as natives who moved, or whether or not they were heritage speakers themselves. Your age didn't matter. So I couldn't predict, well, if you were 16, you would have produced more, but literacy seemed to matter quite a bit. And here's how it mattered. It matters beautifully, actually. So now what you see is from no literacy exposure whatsoever, they don't even engage in self type of literacy, to self type of literacy, you know, texting and doing what they can, to having 3 or more years to 5 years. You have a difference. You can go to the article, it's published a couple of years ago, from it's as much as 16 times more likely to fall within the range of monolingual production if you had 5 years of education in the heritage language, and that was separated. If it was just 3 years, so maybe we found somewhat of a sweet spot, it was less, but not dramatically, okay? Now, by the way, you could say, well, maybe just having that extra boost in education matters for using passes at all. It has nothing to do with their German whatsoever. They're all over the place in German. So their education in Turkish predicts how they will fall within the ranges of use for Turkish. It does not predict anything about German at all, okay? Okay, so following up from this, Fatih, Anika, and Mike Iverson, they did a study looking at other data sets. They were combining 2 data sets that they have, and this is controlled production, okay? So this is production, classical experiments. I'm only gonna show you this one, and I wanna tell you, because I forget to say this often, these are the same people you just saw, okay? The exact same people you just saw, where passives were conditioned by the extent to which they had L1 literacy. So we can conclude that L1 literacy matters, but that doesn't mean it matters for everything. So now what we're gonna do is they did a Frog Where Art Thou story, a very classical story of production. So it's a picture book that doesn't have any words. And now let's see what happens. I'm going to show you 2 measures of, more than 2 measures, but 2 measures that they did. And I'm going to show you type token ratio. So this is lexical richness and density, but probably most of you know what it is. You can read as I'm speaking what it actually is. And morphosyntactic complexity. I recognize that this is a can of worms, and that I didn't necessarily 100% agree with this, but it's a standardized measure that existed for Turkish, and it was employed. And this is defining this as interclausal density, so proportion of embedded clauses, so on and so forth, okay? Okay, so now we're looking at type token frequency and morphosyntactic complexity. And in aggregate, this is what it shows, okay? Running in the running of the model, the final reduced model containing only the variable parental background was statistically significant. That's true for type token frequency and morphosyntactic complexity. Literacy didn't matter now, all of a sudden. These are the same learners. So when you're looking at things like lexical density and richness, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Parental, and you can imagine if you had 2 immigrants from Turkey, their lexical richness and density went up. Probably the quantities and the qualities, their input also go up. Okay, so the take-home point here is to say, even in the same heritage speakers, when we find a particular variable, that doesn't mean that that's explanatory or mutually exclusive to other properties and distinctions that exist within their graphs, okay? So to kind of sum up in study 1, and these are tweens. Do you all know that word? Somebody told me yesterday they hadn't heard that word. So you're a teenager at 13. You're not a child, really, if you're 9. At least 9-year-olds get quite offended when you call them a child. So tween is in betweeners, okay? So this is from 10 years old to 11. So the tweens and the teens, literacy level predicted their passive use, not terribly surprising because of the type of structure that it is. But for looking at more global measures, right, type token frequency and morphosyntactic complexity, the parental background may be something that gives the specificity of the home context and the quality and quantities of input that they're getting seem to be more deterministic for more global measures. And I think that makes sense as well. Different variables seem to matter for distinct aspects of heritage language performances, something we all need to keep in mind. There is no one reason or variable that explains specific heritage speaker outcomes, either in relation to unachievable baseline assumptions or proper baseline assumptions when we do them, maybe by testing their parents as opposed to a random group of, quote, monolinguals, or relative to one another across the heritage language continuum, much less across all aspects of a single heritage speaker grammar or their grammatical performances. Acknowledging this requires a shift in research mentality and approach, at least for empirical work. We must endeavor to understand heritage language grammars in their own right, case by case. Why do heritage speakers differ as they do from one another? For me, that is the question that should be moving forward in 2020 onward. How and why? In answering or attempting to answer this, I think we'll understand better the value, the multiplicity of the value that heritage speakers as a natural laboratory within linguistics, within language processing, within understanding the brain better, and understanding formal linguistic analyses better provides. Equally crucial, what variables correlate to each grammar's individual outcome, domain by domain or proxy by proxy. Okay, so here's some recommendations for future research. Background data collection. We need more sophisticated measures and bespoke measures or specific and unique measures to capture the how, which we can allow statistical modeling and actually statistical modeling that allow us to understand the dynamic relationship of interactions, not just that there is an interaction or that there is a four-way interaction, hopefully not, three-way interaction we can deal with perhaps a little bit better, but what is the directionality of that influence? So structural equation modeling and so on. Okay, attempt to fair determination of input each heritage speaker has received. And of course, Bielect is just one example. I know that Cecile and Sharon and Ludovica are working on a new measure that attempts to do this and takes this very seriously. Administer sophisticated and hopefully normed background and language engagement measures. I know that Tanya Kupish and her team in Germany have been working on one that's specific for heritage speakers. I'm a big fan of the LSBQ, but it's not necessarily it's not made for heritage speakers, let's say, but maybe we can work to make a version of it that is specific. Use appropriate proficiency measures. These need to be created. They really do, because the ones we have do not capture anything that we should really take as reliable, in my humble opinion. Okay, and I talked about statistical modeling and reporting. Okay, so some general conclusions. We're approaching the end here. Heritage speakers, as I said before, are native speakers, right? Their grammars are not broken nor impure. They are different. Our goal is to understand them. And I would venture to say, although I don't claim to be a pedagogue or really know much about it, for those of you who might be listening and are teachers, your job is not to fix them. Just like my English classes that I took, and your Icelandic classes if you're Icelandic, and your Spanish or Castilian classes if you grew up in Argentina, or your Dutch classes as you grew up in Holland, were not intended nor designed to fix your colloquialisms, but to provide you with a different register. And if we take that approach, potentially, we might catch more flies with honey as well. But it's important for teachers to understand they're not fixing them. They're providing the same service that native speakers get, but at a much younger age in a majority language context. Recall that although heritage speakers may diverge from monolinguals, frankly, how could they not? They're not monolingual. They have universally complying, coherent, and complex grammars worthy of description in their own right. And most people take that as a given now, okay? Heritage speaker grammars are unlikely to be as uniform as certain monolingual ones. Again, we don't need to go very far in any of the languages we study if we start or stop ignoring the variation or stop privileging a particular version of a grammar. Of course, we see that as well. But heritage speakers admittedly have much more variation. Even a brother and a sister, a brother and a brother in the same house who should have comparable quantities and qualities of input, but they're different people, so they've had different experiences, of course. They can differ quite a bit from each other, and not necessarily by age in the way that it would be predictable by introducing the other language. I think that this is awesome. There you go, I'm American. It's awesome for linguistic theory, actually. A heritage speaker bilingual outcomes sit on a dimension of lingualism. I'd like to convince you of that. This is why I don't like the comparison of monolingualism, because that's increasingly problematic. Heritage speakers are types of linguals, if you will, and there are not heritage speakers. I gave you 8 scenarios. In the literature, you will find that all of those are documented as either heritage speakers or heritage learners. So people who come in with different attitudes, needs, and also access to input if they have a cultural heritage or not, right? Even if they don't speak the language. There's not a heritage speaker or a type of heritage speaker. There are types of heritage speakers, like there are types of so-called monolinguals. We all said a continuum of lingualism. Input and experience are not everything, because some people think I'm saying that somewhat as a traitor to the paradigm I was brought up, and I'm not a traitor, but clearly play an important role. They clearly play an important role. And determining what those are, if you're interested in things that are more universal or more formal, in whatever air quotes that means, then you need to get away the other stuff so you know what you're looking at. So no matter what and what your purpose is, we need to take this very seriously, either because it's the object of our study itself or because they're nuisance variables that we need to make sure we're controlling for properly. And that includes properly understanding their determinism in the process. Input and experience, I said that. Consistency in data collection and reporting, method by method and across them, as well as clarity and deep thought about terminology will lead to maximal comparability across studies and data sets. There is very poor comparability across studies, even when it's the same language, okay? And that's also because heritage Spanish, to take, maybe the most widely studied language in the context of the US, it's not the same in Miami as it is in rural Iowa, as it is in San Diego County, which is 4 miles if you get the edge of San Diego to the Mexican border, to El Paso, Texas, to the middle of Vermont, and so on and so forth, okay? So we need to take these things quite seriously. In doing so, I propose to you what we all know, but I haven't seen visually before. Remember that heritage speaker trajectory that we saw that's simulated? Here's what I think it really looks like. Because there isn't one heritage speaker. There are multiple trajectories, developments, and outcomes. And our job is to not just reverse engineer from outcomes of a limited sample, but to understand what the variables are that contribute to this. And that includes studying development over time. And this is what we're trying to do, and I'm really almost done, to take an experience to outcomes approach to understanding things. Very, very thankful to many, several grants, 5 different grants running in our lab right now on heritage speakers, 4 of which are funded by the European Commission and 1 by the Tromsø Research Foundation. And here is a picture of all the wonderful people who just happen to work with me on these grants. I'm part of a very large research center up here in Tromsø, the Aqua Aurora Center, and there could be another slide full of pictures, of course, of people, 2 others of which are plenary speakers at this event, right? So these are just the people that work on these projects that are in the my left-hand corner. Correlational analyses from input and those sophisticated measures to really understand, and complex modeling to understand how, if we capture the data right, how those things are predictive and how they are explainable to individual level outcome. We're going to be creating corpora. There are some corpora in heritage languages. They're fit for purpose, and for their purposes, they're fantastic, but they're not necessarily holistically good. The Nordic corpus that's done out of Oslo, of course, is wonderful, and it's a limited type of data because these people, unfortunately, largely don't even exist anymore. But you're limited because it's a free type of conversation. There's a really large research unit in Germany, the RUEG project, and they've done this. They've collected corpora by doing elicited production in a controlled way by crossing 2 variables, formality and now I just forgot, formality and modality. Okay, so the formality is they give them a context, and it's an accident, and they have to do 2 written forms, sending a text to a friend and filling out a police report. The formality is different, but both written form. And formality in the spoken form, they have to speak to a police officer who they're calling to report the accident, versus telling their friend, right? So you can imagine the difference that that might induce, or not, depending on whether heritage speakers control register. But of course we can do more, and we're working with Tanya Kupish and I and several of the postdocs with Steffi Wolf, who is a corpus linguist, to create these. The creation of continuous proficiency measures, hybrid cross-sectional longitudinal study. In my last slide, I'll show you very briefly a little bit about that. And then combined methodologies, kind of the older way, the behavioral way, which there's nothing wrong with newer methodologies. And we are doing eye tracking studies, and we are doing EEG studies. We've moved some of the eye tracking studies to online. Wish us luck through Gorilla. We hope that it works. It seems to be working okay. Unfortunately, the EEG studies are going to have to wait a little bit longer than we wanted for the obvious reasons. So here is the first project, and this project is headed by Maki Kubota, who is the postdoc who is hired for this project. And this is that cross-sectional longitudinal study type that I was talking about. Before COVID, it would have been completely longitudinal, and we would have worked with a reduced number of Japanese heritage speakers. We were going to do it in the Dusseldorf area, where there's a lot of people who are of Japanese descent. And we were going to test them over three years, and we were going to vary ages. So we would have had a pool with the 3 years of testing from about 6 years old to 18 years old. Well, the world did not plan for us to do this, obviously, so we have migrated this now to a much larger scale. We're planning on testing 300 Japanese heritage speakers via internet. And in order to keep it engaging with the age ranges we want, you can see some of the pictures that are below. We're looking at classifiers, and we're also looking at morphological case in Japanese. And here is the storyboard. So this is all animated. It took a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of people, especially Maki, but a wonderful visual art firm in England who is constructing all of these. These are just storyboards, so stay tuned. And I want to leave you with one final message, and it's the following. Differences between heritage speakers and monolinguals, or differences between heritage speakers and heritage speakers, should not, in my view, be viewed under a deficit approach, but for what they are. Remember that apple with the bite out of it that you saw in a previous slide? They should be viewed as distinct types of apples, from which we have much to learn. So that red apple with the bite out of it, whether we think we do or not, our wording and our and the way in which we approach the object of research sometimes gives that message, whether or not we think that. They're just green apples. They're delicious. I actually prefer the tartness of a Granny Smith anyway. With that, thank you very much for your time and for listening.